Meeting social needs. Our technically based industrial economy, together with modern capitalism, has dictated the form in which the social problem presents itself today. Acting like a force of nature, it has given our social life its peculiar internal structure and ways of working. While men's attention was absorbed by what technical industry and capitalism brought with them, it became diverted from other spheres of the social life. Yet these also need direction by conscious human intelligence if the body social is to be healthy. I may, perhaps, be allowed at this point to draw a comparison that will help in picturing what health in the body social implies. But keep in mind that this is a comparison only. The human organism, that most complex of all natural organisms, can be described as consisting of three systems working side by side. To a certain extent, each functions separately and independently of the others. One of these consists of the life of the nerves and senses. It may be named after the part where it is more or less centered, the head organism. Second comes what we need to recognize as another branch if we really want to understand the human organism, the rhythmic system. This includes the breathing and the circulation of the blood, everything that finds expression in rhythmic processes in the human organism. The third must be recognized as consisting of all those organs that have to do with the actual transformation of matter, the metabolic process. These three systems comprise everything that, duly coordinated, keeps the whole human complex in healthy working order. So there must be, in the healthy social organism, another system of life, alongside and independent of the economic life, where human rights can develop and find suitable administration. The rights life is, strictly speaking, the political sphere, the true sphere of the state. If the interests men have to serve in their economic life are carried over into the legislation and administration of the rights state, then these rights will merely be an expression of economic interests. At the same time, if the rights state takes on the management of economic affairs, it is no longer fitted to rule men's life of rights. All that it does and establishes will be forced to serve man's need for commodities, and as a result be diverted from those impulses that make for the life of rights. That is why a healthy social organism requires the independent political life of the state as a second branch alongside the economic sphere. In the economic complex, men will be guided by the forces of economic life itself in the production and interchange of commodities. In the state, institutions will arise where dealings between individuals and groups will be settled on lines that satisfy men's sense of right. This demand for a complete separation of the rights state from the economic sphere is based on life as it actually is. Those who seek to combine the two are not proceeding realistically. Of course, people engaged in economic life possess the sense of right, but they will only be able to legislate and administrate from a sense of right alone, without mixing economic interests in, when they come to consider questions of right independently in a rights state. Such a state takes no part in economic life. This rights state, with its legislature and administration, will be built up on those human impulses which nowadays go by the name democratic. The legislative and administrative bodies in the economic domain will arise out of the forces of economic life. Transactions between the executive heads of the two spheres will be carried on much as those between governments of sovereign states are handled today. They will influence each other in a healthy way that is impossible when their functions are intermingled. So just as, on the one hand, the economic life is subjected to the conditions of the nature basis, it is, on the other hand, dependent on those relations in right that the state establishes between individuals and groups engaged in economic work. In this way, the boundaries are designated for the proper and possible activities of economic life. In the present social organism, as developed in the course of historical evolution, economic life occupies an unduly large place. It sets upon the whole social movement the peculiar stamp it has acquired from the machine age and modern capitalism. It has come to include more than it should include in any healthy society. In present-day economic trading, where only commodities should be dealt in, we find also human labor and human rights. At present, one can trade within the economic sphere that rests on the division of labor, not only commodities for commodities, but commodities for human labor and for human rights as well. By commodity, I mean everything that through human activity has acquired the form in which it is finally brought by man to its place of destination for consumption. Economists may perhaps find this definition objectionable or inadequate, but it may be serviceable toward an understanding of what properly belongs to economic life. Footnote, author's note, for the purposes of life, what is wanted in an explanation is not definitions drawn from theory, but ideas that give a picture of a real, live process. As used in this sense, commodity denotes something that plays an actual part in man's life and experience. Any other concept of it either omits or adds to this, and so fails to tally exactly with what really and truly goes on in life. End of footnote. When anyone acquires a plot of land by purchase, one must regard it as an exchange of the land for commodities, for which the purchase money stands as the proxy. The plot of land, however, does not act as a commodity in the economic life. It holds its position in the body social through the right the owner has to use it. There is an essential difference between this right of use and the relation of a producer to the commodity he produces. From the very nature of the producer's relation to his product, it cannot enter the totally different man-to-man relation created by somebody's having been granted the sole right to use a certain piece of land. Other men are obliged to live on this land, or the owner sets them to work on it for their living. Thus he brings them into a state of dependence upon himself. On the other hand, the fact of mutually exchanging genuine commodities that one produces or consumes does not establish a dependence that affects the man-to-man relation in the same kind of way. To an unprejudiced mind, it is clear that a fact of actual life such as this must, in a healthy society, find due expression in its social institutions. So long as there is simply an interchange of commodities for commodities in economic life, the value of these is determined independently of relations of right. As soon as commodities are interchanged for rights, the rights relation is itself affected. The exchange in itself is not the question here. Such an exchange is inevitable in the modern social organism, which rests on division of labor. The point is that through this interchange of rights and commodities, rights themselves are turned into a commodity when the source of right lies within the economic life. The only way of preventing this is by having two sets of institutions in the body social. Then again, if the rights state takes no part whatever in any branch of industrial economy, the institutions it establishes will only be such as spring from a sense of right among its members. Although those sitting in its representative body may, and of course will, be the same people who are taking an active part in economic life, Nevertheless, owing to the division of the economic and rights life, the health of the body social will not be undermined. Economic life will not be able to exert such an influence on the rights life as can happen when the state itself organizes branches of economic life. In that case, representatives of the economic world sit as political legislators, making laws to suit economic interests. A person in public life today usually turns his attention to secondary considerations. This is because his habits of thought lead him to regard the body social as uniform in structure. As such, however, there is no form of suffrage he can devise that will fit it. The economic interests and the impulses of human rights will come into conflict in the legislature, no matter how it is elected. This conflict will affect social life in a way that is bound to bring severe shocks to the whole organism of society. The first and indispensable thing to be worked for in public life today must be the complete and thorough separation of economic life from the rights organization. As the separation becomes gradually established and people grow into it, something else will happen. The two organizations will, in the course of this process, each discover its own most appropriate method of selecting its legislators and administration. Where the old conditions still exist, these can be taken as the basis from which to work toward the new separation of functions. Where the old order has already melted away or is in process of dissolution, individuals and small groups of people must find the initiative to start reconstructing along the new lines of growth. To try in 24 hours to bring about a transformation in public life is recognized by thoughtful socialists themselves as midsummer madness. They look to gradual, opportune changes to bring about what they regard as social welfare. Money and labor are not interchangeable values, but only money and the products of labor. Accordingly, if I give money for labor, I am doing something that is unreal. I am making a sham transaction, for in reality I can only give money for the product of labor. End of footnote. What really happens is that the employer receives, in return from the worker, commodities that cannot exist unless the latter devotes his labor power to creating them. The worker receives one part, the employer the other part of the value of the commodity so created. The production of the commodity is the result of a cooperation between employer and employed. The product of their joint action is what first passes into the circuit of economic life. For the product to come into existence, there must be a relation in rights between worker and enterpriser. But the capitalist type of economy is able to convert this rights relation into one determined by the employer's superiority in economic power over the employed. In a healthy social order, it will be obvious that labor cannot be paid for one cannot set an economic value upon it comparable to the value of a commodity. The commodity produced by this labor first acquires an economic value by comparison with other commodities. The kind of work a man must do for the maintenance of the body social, how he does it, and the amount must be settled according to his abilities and the conditions of a decent human existence. This is only possible when such questions are settled by the political state, quite independently of the provisions and regulations made in the economic life. The subordination of the general economic prosperity to the common sense of right is the only thing that can prevent man from being so used up and consumed by economic life that his existence no longer seems to him worthy of a human being. It is this sense of an existence unworthy of human beings that is really at the bottom of social convulsions. if the general standard of economic well-being should become too much lowered on the rights side, there is a way of preventing this. It is the same as with the nature basis, where technical means can be used to make a less productive soil more productive. So if prosperity declines too much, the methods and amount of work can be changed. Only it should be realized that such changes must not be a direct consequence of processes in the economic life. They should be the outcome of insight arrived at on the free ground of rights, independent of economic life. The foundation for this kind of activity lies in that force in man that develops through the human performance itself, a free, spontaneous receptivity on the part of the public is the only sound and wholesome channel for the reception of such creative work. If its acceptance depends on the economic life or on the state, there is a check on such independent public reaction. There is only one possible line of healthy evolution for the spiritual cultural life of the body social. What it does must come out of its own impulses, and those served by it must be connected with it by close ties of sympathy and understanding. Parenthetically, we must point out the need of remembering by what countless fine threads this spiritual life is connected with the evolution of all other human potentialities. Here we have sketched the necessary conditions for a sound evolution of the spiritual life of the body social. People do not see this clearly because they are used to seeing the spiritual life fused and confused with the state system. This fusing process has been going on for several hundred years, and people have become used to it. They talk about, quote, freedom of knowledge, unquote, and, quote, freedom of education, unquote, but consider it a matter of course that the political state should have control of this free knowledge and free education. They neither see nor feel how in this way the state is bringing all spiritual life into a dependence on state requirements. The notion is that the state provides the educational posts and the spiritual life then unfolds, quote-unquote, freely under the hands of the people who fill these state posts. People come to forget the intimate connection between the innermost nature of man and the content of the spiritual life growing up within him. They do not realize that it is impossible for the growth of this spiritual content to be really free if it owes its place in the body social to any other impulses than those that proceed from the spiritual life itself. Science has received its whole mold and form from its being under state management in recent centuries, and with it all that part of the spiritual life that it affects. This fusion with the state has affected its content, its inner substance as well. Of course, the results of mathematics or physics cannot be directly influenced by the state, but have not history and other subjects of general culture come to be an obedient mirror of state requirements? An independent position in society is an absolute necessity for art, science, and a philosophy of life, along with all that goes with them. For in spiritual life, everything is interrelated. State requirements cannot directly influence the substance of mathematics, for instance, or physics. But state requirements do influence the way such things are applied and the estimation put on them whenever some branches of spiritual life are under state control. It is quite a different thing when the teacher in the lowest grade in school follows the state line than when he takes his line from a spiritual life that rests on his own independent footing. Here again the social democrats have simply taken over a habit of thought from the ruling classes when they have the ideal of incorporating the spiritual life into a social structure based on a system of industrial economy. If they accomplish this, it would simply be a further step along the road that has led to the present depreciation of spiritual life. The socialist maxim, quote, religion is a man's private affair, unquote, expressed what is a right perception, but in a one-sided way. In a healthy society, all spiritual life must, in this sense, be a private affair, as far as the state and economic life are concerned. When teachers, artists, and others have no direct connection with any legislature or government, they will find they have an altogether different influence. They will be able to awaken an understanding for what they are creating. Also, things will be different when they are appealing to people who are not simply under compulsion to labor, but for whom an independent, autonomous political state also ensures the right to leisure. Leisure awakens the mind to an appreciation of spiritual values. At this point, somebody will probably tell you, out of practical experience, in quotes, that if the state made definite provision for people to have leisure hours, and at the same time school attendants were left to their own common sense, they would simply spend all their leisure in bars and taverns and would relapse into illiteracy. Let such pessimists wait and see what will happen when the world is no longer under their influence. Too often their approach is inspired by a feeling of how they themselves like to spend their leisure hours, and memory of what they had to do to get a little education. Naturally, they take no account of the free spiritual life and its power to enkindle. They only know the spiritual life in bondage, and it has no power to light any sparks in them. When the body spiritual of society is administering itself, both the state and the economic system will get from it that steady inflow from the spiritual life of which they are in need. Also, when the economic and spiritual bodies can cooperate in freedom, it will be found that practical training for the economic life will, for the first time, be able to develop its full possibilities. People will come suitably trained into the economic field and put life into everything they meet there, with the strength they derive from the liberated treasures of the spiritual. And people with economic experience will find their way into the spiritual organization and help fructify what needs fructifying there. Within the political state, the effect of spiritual abilities being left free will be the growth of sane and sound views, which are needed in this field. As a result of such abilities, the man who works with his hands will find a place in the body social that will give him satisfaction. He will get a sense of the inner interconnection of his own labor with those organizing forces that he can trace to the development of individual human talents. The political state will give him a basis on which he can establish the rights that secure to him his share of the returns from the commodities he produces. He will also freely allot to the spiritual property from which he benefits a sufficient portion to keep it productive. There will be a possibility for producers in the spiritual cultural field to live on the proceeds of their work. Our modern age demands of man that he place himself consciously into the social organism. This new social consciousness, however, must be oriented from three sides if it is to shape men's life and conduct in a healthy way. It is this threefold line of evolution that modern humanity is striving toward in the soul's unconscious depths. What finds an outlet in the social movement is simply a dulled reflection of this striving. One will come to comprehend what the life of the body social is when one perceives fully the part played by these three principles of brotherhood: equality and freedom in a real, workable form of society. Then it will be recognized that men's cooperation in economic life must rest on the brotherhood that springs up out of the associations. The second system is that of common rights, where one is dealing with purely human relations between one person and another. Here one must strive to realize the ideas of equality. In the spiritual field, which stands in comparative independence in the body social, it is the idea of freedom that needs to be realized. Seen in this way, these three ideals reveal their value for real existence. They can find realization neither in a chaotic social life nor in a social state constructed on an abstract centralized scheme, but only in the threefold working of a healthy social organism. There, each of the three branches can derive its strength from one of these ideal impulses, and all three branches will work fruitfully in conjunction. Those people at the end of the 18th century who first demanded recognition of these three ideas, freedom, equality, brotherhood, already had a dim sense of where the forces of human evolution were tending. So also did those who took up the cry again later on. They still believed in the one-fold state, where these ideas involve a contradiction. They, nevertheless, pinned their faith to this contradiction, because in their subconscious depths there was this striving toward the threefold order of society, in which their triad can achieve a higher unity. To lay hold of these evolutionary forces that are working toward the threefold order, and to make of them a conscious social will and purpose, is what is demanded of us at the present time. It is demanded in unmistakable language by the hard facts of the social situation. What are we seeking to achieve through the kind of delineation I have just described? Well, spiritual life is to stand apart from everything else. It is to develop on its own foundation, and only carry out actions that come out of its own impulses. We are striving to ensure that spiritual life is no longer entwined in political and economic life, but rather free and independent, in a way the Catholic Church, which was always tangled up in political and economic life, could never be. We want to ensure that we are in a position to bring all of the impulses of spiritual life into reality. Think about how ridiculous, how superficial it is when someone says that anthroposophy should not try to move into political life, when it is actually anthroposophy that is demanding a social organization in which spiritual life would no longer be connected to politics at all. We should create a political system in which spiritual life can give form to itself, can have its own inner organization. And it should no longer be the case that when you want to found a school or rework a curriculum, you have to turn to individuals in the political sphere, for this is what makes us dependent upon politics. In this example, you can see what truly clear thinking means in comparison to the way in which people take in what comes flying toward them and then simply stumble upon opinions about impulses that come out of the spiritual world. For the idea of the threefold social order comes out of initiation science. And the person who says that anthroposophically oriented spiritual science should have nothing to do with the threefold social order does not understand anything at all, and is not thinking clearly. Furthermore, that person does not understand anything about the true impulses of spiritual science, and does not see that these matters, which are connected with the great tasks of this time, are taken out of the impulses of spiritual science. Countless assessments, rife with the same sort of contradictions, are publicly aired and then parroted along by a large portion of the population these days. The task that lies before us is, above all else, to attempt to arrive at a pure, clear, inwardly true thinking, free also from any attachment to nationalistic chauvinism. We will not get there unless we first recognize that right now we are very far from it. For if you do not feel how distant the judgments made today are from a place of objectivity, you will not feel the impulse to arrive at clarity, at a thinking that is inwardly true. In recent history, we have experienced an increased intermingling within the social order of spiritual life, rights life, and economic life. Modern parliaments strive, by a process of majority rules, to make decisions regarding matters about which its members may know nothing. decisions about matters that can really only be decided by someone who does know something about them. A single parliament is supposed to make decisions about all manner of things, about spiritual life, about political life, about economic life. Yet in the moment when spiritual life, let us start there, is divided from the other two, from the rights, political, and from the economic spheres, it is only then that it is fully brought to human beings. Spiritual life becomes its own organism. Spiritual life should give form to itself, according to the same principles by which it is constantly being drawn up from the depths. People who have something to teach should also be the ones to give form to the process by which teachers are hired, or to the form that the schools take. Spiritual life should be allowed to support itself in complete freedom. This will ensure that the capabilities of each individual are always called up in service to spiritual life. This will ensure that those decisions which must be made regarding spiritual life are dependent upon the capabilities of human beings, the capacities of those human beings who are present at the time of the decision. This is the way it should be. It should not be that those who are capable of doing something or other in a particular era, at a particular time, are hindered or prevented by some sort of state or parliamentarian structure in bringing that capability forth. If, for example, an economic organization is built solely upon egotism, then human beings will be hermits, in a very extreme sense, between death and a new birth. They will have great difficulty even finding other human beings. To put it briefly, the way in which people conduct themselves in economic life has a tremendous impact on the life between death and the next birth. This leaves the rights or political life, which is the only one that is purely earthly. It holds no meaning for life either pre-birth or post-death. It only holds meaning for what happens here on earth. If we completely separate the rights life from the two others, we also separate the earthly from all of the more than earthly things that are a part of our existence on earth. Thus there are significant principles underlying the relationships outlined in the threefold social order. We divide affairs into three realms because we must hold the two vastly different areas related to the supersensory world apart from the only one related solely to the sensory life between birth and death. The things in human life that can only be decided through majority votes, those things can have significance here on earth. The things we do because of talents or capacities that we were born with and develop throughout our life, as I have described to you, these things are done out of one's human individuality, and the, quote, prince of this world, close quote, to use an old turn of phrase, rules from his throne in the moments when majority decisions somehow hinder that individuality. Majority rulings can be applied, it should be reiterated, only to things relating to purely earthly affairs. Because for everything that holds meaning after death, the strength of human love, humanity, and goodwill, all things that are and can only be left to the individual, must be developed. Along with this, let me point out something here that further strengthens the idea of the threefold social order, but can only be gained through initiation science. What areas of our world does the infiltration of luciferic and ahrimanic forces affect? The infiltration of all luciferic and ahrimanic forces causes something to move into the world from out of abnormal spectrums of consciousness. When we come into the world through the gates of birth, we leave a normal spectrum of consciousness of an entirely different nature than the earthly, and enter into the earthly spectrum of consciousness. At this point in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, dream consciousness, which is to say a daytime consciousness filled with dream images, is abnormal. If we allow dreams to enter our thinking, we mix something we are only to have during our life prior to birth with all that plays out in our life between birth and death. And this intermingling is especially helpful to Lucifer in the achievement of his goal for us, which is not the normal, godly goal of earth. Any time abnormal dream elements play into present-day consciousness, this can only lead to a greater influence of Lucifer on humanity. It is normal to allow ourselves to develop in a dreamlike state during the time in which our consciousness is itself still dreamlike, namely during childhood. If we maintain the same relationship to the world that is perfectly natural for a child, for example during the years in which we should learn to speak as though learning it in a dream, beyond the age of childhood, which a large portion of humanity does these days, then we are throwing open all of the doors and gates and windows and every other entryway that can be opened to our consciousness and allowing Lucifer to enter. If we take on public opinions as our own and do not lay a foundation for our judgments that is any deeper than the foundation laid in dreams, we are holding open the gate for Lucifer. When, for example, we are told by one side or another to consider someone a great statesman or a great ruler or not to be blamed for the war or a great general, without examining it ourselves, then our reasons for having such an opinion are no different than our reasons for dreaming one thing or another. A great number of people had, until recently, considered Woodrow Wilson a great man, because he brought those nonsensical 14 points into the world. Ask yourself about the inner conviction people felt in expressing this high opinion of him, and you will find that there is no difference between the conviction they felt in thinking Woodrow Wilson a great man and the conviction they feel about something they dream. The dream comes to them with the same inner willfulness or unwillfulness as this judgment of Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. There is no difference between dreaming while fully conscious and dreaming while sleeping. There is no difference between agreeing with the voices of the external world that Ludendorff is a great general or Clemenceau is a great statesman, and dreaming at night about one thing or another. But we must be aware of this, because in noticing such things we simultaneously arrive at an understanding of how Luciferic forces take hold of us in the world. We are grasped by Luciferic forces in the world in the moments when we dream while conscious. Regarding general public opinion, a large number of people in the world today have acted in a truly childish way and continue to do so to this day. These are matters that must be taken even more seriously than most people believe. And the other important thing is that we learn lessons from life. Regarding the will, we are completely asleep. I have often said this before. I have said to you, you have mental pictures of what you do, but not of what inwardly directs your hand when you move it. People do not typically have any imagination of that. It may be the case that many people today are now comfortable with the threefold social order. But there are two choices in the world today, and those who see things truthfully and properly have no illusions about it. They see that there are two choices. Either Bolshevism spreads over the entire world, or we establish the threefold social order. Perhaps you do not like the idea of threefolding. In that case, you are choosing an old world order. Think for a moment about what is left of a large portion of Europe in the wake of these last 4 or 5 years. Consider the individual areas. For example, take a look at Austria, Germany. As it is currently, with the exception of certain individuals whom I have written about in my book titled The Riddles of the Human Being, its general substance can be traced back to the Catholic principles of the 8th and 9th centuries AD. Those principles are still living there, as is evidenced first by the naturally unifying presence of the so-called Habsburg House, then by the altogether unnaturally unifying presence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Or, consider, for example, that area once made up of the nations of the Holy Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungary. Its entire constitution is still more or less the same as it was in 1000 AD. And we could go through every area one by one and identify the period from which its general essence stems. Tomorrow, I will speak more about these matters, and in particular about the relationship between what I have said today and an understanding of the Christ impulse.